James Young, professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, welcome. I would like you to tell us about your work, your studies, your research from memory and more towards your specialization on memorials, because we in translation are especially or particularly interested in that aspect of it as we are working on translation and memory. So,
Well, I'm glad to. Thanks for having me. As a graduate student, I was once upon a time writing a dissertation on Holocaust literature, how history is shaped in literature, literary narrative, including historical chronicles, diaries, memoirs, even theater, poetry, oral testimony. And as part of that research, I spent lots of time in archives and museums, both in New York at YIVO, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which used to be up on 86th Street and Fifth Avenue. And then in Israel at Yad Vashem, the National Memorial Authority, where I did archival research, digging up diaries and memoirs, things that hadn't been published yet. And I spent almost 2 years in Europe at one point, looking into archives in Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Holland, France, and found that the sites themselves often shaped the kind of memory and understanding of historical events that I was investigating. My focus was on how history was shaped by historical narrative. But then I realized that kind of my study would have to be two-pronged. I wanted to know both what happened and how what happened was being passed down to me, that I couldn't know one without the other. I couldn't know hard Holocaust history without also knowing how this hard history was being transmitted to me and to the next generation via diaries, via memoirs, via testimony, via memorials and museums. And increasingly, I found myself in these archives researching, very fragile texts and diaries at Auschwitz, actually looking at Sonderkommando diaries, which had been hidden in little tin cans and buried right next to the gas chambers, by the Sonderkommando, who were then killed, the next day. And as I sat in rooms like this, and this would have been about 1980, 81, I allowed my gaze to go from the table in this library with all these diaries and things laid out in front of me, which I had been transcribing, and kind of, I couldn't ignore kind of the tactile sensation, holding them in my hand, like feeling like I was holding a fragment of the events that I was trying to study and understand. And at that point, at that moment, I realized as I let my gaze go up that where I read these things and in what languages I was reading them, these happened to be written in Yiddish. And so I was transcribing and translating at the very same time. So immediately, as historical documents, they're being converted for me by translation, so that there were no Xerox machines, so that my very first level of transcribing was an act of translation and getting them into English so that I could take my notes. And then I realized that the buildings themselves were somehow conditioning how I came to understand these, that the brick barracks, this had been the library at Auschwitz, was a barracks which had actually held prisoners. And in fact, before it had held prisoners, it had held Polish army horses that had been their stables. And so the Germans took over this, this Polish army base, horse stables, converted them into barracks for prisoners. In the beginning, mostly political prisoners, eventually Jewish prisoners, and then they built this camp at Birkenau, about a mile down the road, where Jews and Gypsies were housed, interned and murdered. Um, but the ruins around me, rhetorically, had the effect of kind of collapsing time. So I wasn't just reading something that was 40 or 50 years old. I seemed to be reading something connected to, a hard artifact, a hard material artifact that I could pick up and smell and touch and see and drop and hear. And all of that now mattered, so that even my own footsteps, on the gravel crunching through the camp on my way to the library, or leaving the library and going out into walking over to Birkenau and spending 3 hours, among the gas chamber crematorium complexes where the Zone to Commando diaries had come from. They were all connected materially in my mind, so that for better or worse, the texts, literary texts, the national narratives, the ruins, the ground, the topography, all kind of collapsed into one big text. I couldn't read one outside the other. So I came back from one of those summers and to present my work to my dissertation readers in Israel. I had at that point gone to Israel on a Fulbright, where I was spending the next 2 years writing. And one of my readers was Sidra Ezrahi, who had a salon of her graduate students. John Felstiner, my good friend and a wonderful translator of Ceylon, literary biographer, was there that year, just happened to be there. And so he came, along with Yehuda Bauer, and graduate students, and we would have these dinners, and then we graduate students would present our work, what we did that summer.
Wow.
And so I talked about this phenomenon, and they wanted to hear about the literary artifacts.
Sure.
And I said, how can we understand these diaries outside of their materiality?
It must have been pioneering at the time.
Well,
the people weren't thinking along those lines. At least I don't think.
No, they weren't completely, but there was a theoretical basis for it. After Barth and after Semiotics. I mean,
this is
you could
music in the
talk about
Semiotician's
everything.
ear, but it was not
the
common
so-called
sense.
intertexts, as they used to call it. And these teachers of mine just never said no. They listened to what I had to say, and I said, can we ever understand the words on the page outside of the page itself, and where these pages were from, and where they were found, and who wrote on them when, and what did the poor Sonderkommando know at the time as they wrote? That the diaries are fascinating both for what they tell us and for what they can never tell us, because in fact they didn't have the kind of the luxury of hindsight. All they knew was that moment, and so eventually I began to read these diaries, not for names, places, and dates especially, but often for misapprehensions, understanding that as they wrote the events that they were part of, they often responded to events the next day in light of how they understood the events they wrote about the day before. That there was nothing benign about their interpretations, that even if they misinterpreted or misapprehended, or even if they were blinded by the Germans' choreography of their setting, the diarists in the Warsaw Ghetto were completely limited by what the Germans would allow them to know. They could see what they saw on the street, and often they stopped writing when they realized that everything they knew was completely controlled for them by their captors. So they wanted to give eyewitness testimony, but the eyewitness is in fact a very limited, constructed eyewitness choreographed for them by the Germans at the time, who were very good at doing that. They were so smart about it.
So all the other aspects tell more. The space, topography, buildings.
All of it. And then I realized that there were personal narratives, there were national narratives. The place of what we call the Holocaust in German or Polish national history. Auschwitz was a site of national martyrdom, And sure enough, of course, it was a site of national martyrdom. You know, nearly 6 million Poles were killed during World War II. 3.2 million of those Jewish Poles murdered for being Jews, but another, 2.8 or so, non-Jewish Poles who were murdered, for political reasons, as Catholic priests, as intelligentsia, killed in bombings, in actions. 1 out of every 2 Poles during the war, including Polish Jews, was either interned, killed, or injured during the war. It's a huge national catastrophe. And of course, within the places like Auschwitz, there were these competing national narratives. And they even set it up so that there were 23 different barracks, each one telling a different national story. So the so-called internationalization of the Holocaust, as kind of seen by the communist government at the time, was actually a way to atomize the victims. So French Jews were now seen differently from Polish Jews, differently from German Jews, differently from Russian Jews, differently from Hungarian, Dutch, Belgian.
Another translation problem.
All broken into these different groups, but they were all murdered for being Jews. 90% of the victims at Auschwitz were Jewish. And they even got me looking into the transcriptions, so that, the Texture of Memory I described being invited in 1989 by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the new prime minister after the wall came down, and to remake Auschwitz. Literally.
Really?
He said, will you come and help us remake Auschwitz? So Michael Maris and I were the 2 North Americans asked to come up there. So we went, and we stayed in Krakow for the week, and we're out at Auschwitz every day. And of course, the plaques at the end of the railroad tracks said that on this site, between the years 1940 and 1945, 4 million men, women, and children suffered and died here at the hands of the Nazi murderers. Well, as historians, we all knew that the number was about 1.1 or 1.2 million, not 4 million. But the 1967 Polish government, communist government, knew that about 1.2 million Jews had been killed here. And so by increasing the overall number to 4, they could thereby diminish the proportion of Jews killed and inflate the number of political prisoners killed there. Is that a question of translation? Yeah, I mean, it's just a complete political manipulation of the numbers, which is fine. That's what governments do. And so with the change in regime came now a change in memory. And they asked us, what should go. So they erased those, those plaques and then put in new ones. But these are the kinds of things that just fascinate me. So I was interested in literature, and my first book was really dedicated to literature. But the last chapter was then dedicated to memorialization, how museum narratives tell the story in their ways, how nations tell the story back to themselves, often in self-aggrandizing ways, often in ways that are blind to, the suffering of groups that aren't really recognized as their own special groups. And then I recalled very early on, and of course this became really interesting in my work on the Denkmal in Berlin, when in 1997 I was asked to come form a new jury to choose and to figure out a process for Germany's national memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. And they asked, it's kind of the same question you began with, so where did this start? And so I described a little bit about writing these contexts, but then I also described getting off the train as a backpacker in 1976 in Lübeck. I had gotten off to go visit Buddenbrook's house.
Yeah.
Literary pilgrimage,
Sure.
Thomas Mann. Buddenbrook's one of my favorite novels. Take the backpack, get my little loaf of Niederegger marzipan, go visit Buddenbrook's house, and miss my train, which was taking me from there to Copenhagen. So, looking for a youth hostel, I got completely lost. Ended up hitchhiking out to Travemünde, a little teeny beach town.
I know Travemünde.
On with the Preval, which was, you take a ferry to get to the youth hostel, which was now closed because it was late October. It had already closed. It was raining. It was 9 o'clock at night. Anyway, a group of high school kids from the gymnasium from Travemünde, who were in the gymnasium in Lübeck, just took me in, and a family took me in. And the father had been a German naval officer during World War II. He was 19-year-old. He was injured in Norway in the battle for Bergen, and spent the whole war with a shattered leg in a Bergen hospital, attended to by Norwegian doctors and nurses. And returned at the end of the war with a noticeable limp and kind of a damaged leg, and married a Volksdeutsch woman who'd been pushed west when she was from Königsberg, but as the Red Army came, she and all the Germans fled west, and just happened to be, when the war ended, she just happened to be on the west side of Travemünde. There's also an East German side, the Preval. The Grenze was right there, the border was right there. And so the family took me in for 3 weeks. I heard all the war stories. I was the first American, first Jew they'd ever met. So they were I was as much like an object of fascination as their stories were for me. And one day the kids went off to school, and I was home with the dad, and he just said, "Kommst du?" And I got into his little Golf, and we drove out to a beach in Timmendorfer Strand. And he just said, "I want to show you something." It's a little Gedenkstätte, little monument. And the monument was to the Katastrophe der SS Kap Arkona, the catastrophe of the SS Kap Arkona, which was a luxury liner, German luxury liner, which had been packed, there were two actually, each one packed with about 4,000 Häftlinge, that is Jewish prisoners, concentration camp prisoners, who had survived death marches from Auschwitz, come all the way through Germany, Gross-Rosen, through Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, many of them from Ravensbrück, and they were herded up right to the edge of the Baltic Sea on the last days of the war, and they were put on these gigantic luxury liners, which just steamed out into the Baltic. And the RAF bombed them and sank them, killing 8,000 concentration camp prisoners who had survived the death marches, survived Auschwitz. And now, for weeks afterwards, the bodies were washing in, and the local townspeople were burying them, and it was horrible. It was a nightmare for them. So they created a monument on the beach to the catastrophe of the SS Kap Arkona. And so I asked, the dad, I go, "So what was the catastrophe that these poor Jews were marched from Auschwitz and then end up getting bombed by the RAF?" And that's all they said on the sign. The Häftlinge were killed by the Royal Air Force on May 4th, 1945. So it was the Allies who killed these Jews. So where were they going? There's no mention here where they even came from. But I know in doing research that they had been marched, up and kind of floated up the Trava, river, right to the beach, where they were taken out.
James, I lived in Berlin for many, many years, and I tried to talk to people about the past, and there's so much blockage, at least when I was there. You must have a wonderful facility to listen, to talk, to gain trust, I find it very ironic that when the Germans are thinking about this Denkmal to the Jewish people, that they bring in an American to talk to them. Can you
Well, they needed American coverage. I mean, by that point, I had 2 books out, actually 3, with the museum exhibition I curated at the Jewish Museum. And that Jewish Museum exhibition, called The Art of Memory, went to Germany. It was translated into German and installed at the the National Historical Museum in Berlin, and then went from there to the Stadtmuseum in Munich. And when it was installed, I went to give talks and to open up the exhibition. And literally hundreds of thousands of Germans saw it at the Jewish Museum. I think like 280,000 people saw the exhibition. So I was kind of, and I was writing op-ed pieces, for the FAZ, and for Tagesspiegel, and just on the Germany's memorial problem. Because in the beginning, of course, I didn't want there to be a central memorial. I was happy that the debates were as fraught as they were, and I took kind of the academic's delight in no resolution, just
Yes.
Debate after debate, and I would kind of fan the flames a little bit, and said at one point, better 1,000 years of Holocaust memorial competitions in Germany than any final solution to your problem, and and I was happy to explain what I thought the problem was, which is fundamental to Germany. How does a nation recall
a horror?
Crimes it perpetrated?
Yes.
Nations never build their memorial cultures on their national crimes, but always on the memory of their national martyrdoms or their triumphs.
I guess that's my question. There was a silencing, and maybe it was overt and political, but I think a lot of it was induced by trauma and just people.
Sure.
Let's not go there. Now, especially not go rethink that space with an outsider. But I think you have a talent to listen, to gain trust, to get people to show you something, or to get people to begin a conversation that they haven't
Well,
even
I was
begun.
open to going anywhere, just as my mentors were open to my looking at space and buildings as well as narrative and literature. And it might have been something, maybe something special in the late 70s, early 80s when I was writing my dissertation. There was a certain kind of change, just even in disciplines, so that literary scholars were now writing about film and architecture and art, and nobody stopped me from writing about any of these things. Well, maybe they should have.
I think you're opening space for a discourse, and translators know about looking at a blank page too. There's a certain amount of how do you begin, and then once you begin, the beginning starts a process that maybe articulates something or represents something, but that also means often other things are not getting represented. And so if you get started on your translation with the wrong metaphor, the wrong image, or the wrong direction,
Right.
it can be really difficult to repair. And I think what you're doing is, I don't know.
Well, there's a real preoccupation by artists, composers, writers with irreparability after the Holocaust, breaches that can't be mended, irredeemable loss,
Yes.
voids that can't be filled in.
Voids, yes.
So how
do you
to
translate a void?
articulate
Yes.
a void formally without filling it in
Yes.
becomes a literary question, an architectural question, an historical question, and survivors have the same question when they begin telling a story.
Yes.
And so we became very sensitive then to their long pauses and to the silences in their testimony, which became just as significant as what they had to say. In fact, their silences are part of what they have to say. The silences denoting the inability to find a language or a word for a particular memory or experience. And that is also significant, that some of these things and some of these memories were so deep as to remain pre-verbal and inarticulate. And then, to what extent, once they gave them these memories language, were they so unsatisfied with this language, understanding somehow that maybe they had even betrayed the experience by finding language for it. And the diarists were just paralyzed by this. During the war itself, Chaim Kaplan in the Warsaw Ghetto kept laying his pen down.
Yes.
How to describe a disorderly thing in an orderly fashion? I cannot, because once I do that, I've now betrayed the experience. The experience is inchoate. And once I've written it, I have made it comprehensible,
Exactly.
and thereby betray that which I want to represent.
Mm.
I can't do it. And that caused, Elie Wiesel not to write for many years. Primo Levi talked about the same thing when he wrote his memoir later.
Yes.
Yes.
And how is silence translated into language, or into form, into vernacular, visual vernacular. And I know that Daniel Liebeskind has worked with this, the voids within his architecture, and it's become almost a bit of a cliche, I think, in very contemporary art and architecture and sculpture, where there's the preoccupation with voids and gaps and edges that don't meet, and there's a bit of a backlash even, right now against this. But the way that certain artists like Esther Shalev Gertz has explored it in some of her work, and her wonderful work in Paris, in which she took the video testimonies of dozens of survivors, which she filmed herself, and played those so that you could watch those. But then on a big screen at either end of the hall, she had the silences and the pauses in slow motion.
Oh, nice.
So that even as we're hearing the words, she's alerting us to the long pauses and silences between words and memories, or memories that can't quite find language, and to be aware of that. And maybe that we should be listening as much to the silences as to the words. And some of these things maybe can't be translated literarily, but must remain visual.
There's so many things that you speak about naturally, that these coincidences or these layers of many expressions, it's not only, and you saw that it was not sufficient, the diaries, the written language, so you explored other expressions, other languages, other forms of transmission of memory, and that's exactly what we are trying to do and we see that it's necessary for translation that we cannot reduce translation, especially today when we express thoughts and opinions and memories in so many directions. So it's not new, but it has not been developed. You said you started with literature, but then you developed because it was not sufficient in a way. In translation studies, we are so literature fiction centered, as if the only thing to study, you have technical translation on the one side, and it's not interesting from a theoretical point of view because it's only technique. And then the only thing that is really interesting for translation studies is literature. That's where you have experimentation of language and reducing it to be language and text without even considering where this text appears, even the texture of the book, the paratextual elements, nothing is considered. Only the word and the author and how to represent the author.
But you're also thinking about the way that the word itself is already a translation of something deeper.
Yes.
And perhaps untranslatable.
Yes.
There's a movement from that thing in the heart or the memory or the mind, or a loss, just a feeling of loss.
Of course.
That once it is given language has been now translated from the viscera to the intellect in some way.
Definitely.
And with all these layers in mind, I think that sometimes the emphasis on understanding something only in the so-called original language is somewhat misdirected. I know that around video testimony, whether it's the Fortunoff archives at Yale or the Spielberg archives at USC, the survivors are always given a choice as to what language they want to speak in. And I think that's worth a whole dissertation right there. For many of the survivors, the only language they could possibly tell their stories in was the language they experienced them in. So to tell them in English would just be to wash them out. It domesticates them. It completely loses the power of the experience for them. Others say, precisely for that reason, I must tell it in English. That my home language is now so corrupted and tainted by that experience that I can't tell it in Yiddish. I would refuse to tell it in German, the language of the killers. I mean, where they make these conscious decisions.
Sure.
And then a poet like Paul Celan says, what better language than German, which carries within its etymons the memory of murder. That has to be the language in which I write my poetry.
Celan also uses
Then he
a
deformed it.
multilingual
Yeah, it says, he
markers
says it
as
is
well.
death carrying, therefore it will be the language that I use in my poetry. So when we listen to a video testimony or watch somebody, often we can see levels of translation visually. Literally, you see their eyes. Like somebody asks a question, so, what was the deportation like? And the poor survivors thinking, one in particular is thinking of being deported with his grandmother who had a limp. And so he tells the story of his grandmother is limping and asks for help to get up into the cart where they're going to transport them to the railway station, from which they'll be deported to Auschwitz. And so she turns to anybody who could listen, could you please help me get up? And a German officer came up and said, yes, I'll help you. And he drew his revolver and he shot her in front of the little grandson's eyes. And so the survivor, who's now about 40 years old, stops. He's describing this, and then he stops, and you can see his eyes just, he begins to cry, but he's searching. And he's searching at every level. For the language, he's probably censoring, he's probably fighting the image that's now been recalled. All of that's going on. And so what happens on camera is that we sit with him for a minute with no language, only the physical act of his trying to call this back up and to give it language. And then, of course, the interviewer is Dory Laub, a psychoanalyst. And so he interrupts him. Once he says what happened. And Dory Laub says, so I understand you are in emotional upheaval. Did you then cry? And then he catches himself, did I then cry? No, I was too scared to cry. So the therapist does his job. He's now, after all these years, has the space to cry and grieve and mourn. But is that the job of the interviewer? To be a therapist?
Sure.
To be a translator? To be the muse? To pull these kinds of stories out? And this is where video testimony, I think, is just fascinating. And will continue to live when the survivors are gone, and will be very interesting texts. And I think for translation studies, I think what goes on in these video testimonies is really maybe translation specialists like you would have more to say about what goes on in that process than almost anybody. I think, personally.
Bella gave a lecture today, and she was talking about autobiography in translation, and the question came up about intergenerational translation. And there is also a sense that much of the memorializing is being done by the next generation.
Sure.
Maybe more for themselves, and then for the next generation.
They can only remember what they know.
Exactly.
And their experience is the experience of growing up with a survivor, and perhaps the never hearing a story directly except through body language and through stories that were not told. There's music like that. The album Ashes and Dust by Yuta Polliker and Yaakov Gilad, very interesting. Yuta Polliker speaks with a stammer, and says that he stammers because of what happened.
Because of what
You know,
happened.
because of that war, I stammer. Because of that war, we gulp our food down. Because of that war, there's hardly anybody at our family celebrations. They're all dead. You know, because of that war now, he will make his music, you know, which is also wounded kind of music. Art Spiegelman is, I think, you know, kind of the greatest of the, you know, second generation storytellers, because of course he tells the story, not just what happened to his parents, but how he received the story.
How he received the story.
Yes.
How
You
it
have these
shapes him.
two levels,
Yeah.
layers or two
Yeah.
levels of.
And of course his mother's missing story is the missing heart of Maus.
Yeah.
You know, and that the first volumes ended when, you know, he calls his father a murderer for having burned his mother's memoirs and papers because they were too painful for him to read after she committed suicide.
A lot of this gets done in sort of oral testimony, and the videographers, of course, are getting some of these. A lot of it takes place in a private space. It's not a published space. And a lot of it is in a new language because of the Jewish diaspora and the
What does it
new
mean to
countries and the children.
tell these in language? What does it mean to hear it in accented language? In other words, hearing a survivor's testimony in accented, you know, English is just one of the signs that the story came from someplace else. Not just the person came from someplace else, but the story came from someplace else. Another time, another place, another era, something even foreign to, especially to American, you know, English. I mean, Europeans, everybody's more touched and shaped, and every generation is shaped by the one before who experienced the war.
So there's levels of, there's a translation from the self, from the trauma, getting over those repressions and blocks and scares and silences, but then there's also the translation from generation to generation, and then there's also the translation from the language of the event into the language of, I don't know, the memorial or the visitors to that memorial. We do some work at the Translation Center, we do some work for the Holocaust Museum in DC. And it's clearly not, maybe the third generation at this point. People with really limited.
To make it accessible.
Make it
Well, it used to be, and it's just begun to change a little bit, that, you know, to be something called a Holocaust scholar, by definition, meant, in the old-fashioned sense, that you had to command all those languages. But no single person can command all the languages of that period. There are some in Israel who's Hungarian, Czech, Russian, French, German, and Yiddish, and Hebrew. They've got a pretty good start, but there are still other, you know, languages where this happened. You just, you know, you do the best you can. I mean,
did you ever work with an interpreter or a translator, or did you decipher the German and Yiddish?
No, well, you know, German and Yiddish I read, you know, and speak badly, but well enough. That's what makes me a better listener in German, because I'll be happy to listen. And I did answer lots of questions for the press, you know, in German. But when my books are translated into German, they make what I like to think of as my very my kind of poetically simple narrative and kind of theory-based writing. They make very complicated, and they always give me an ironic smile. It's like, you know, we know what you really mean by this, you know, and so suddenly they turn my simple sentences into these very long, complex, you know,
or what about guides at certain sites?
In
or,
Poland, in Poland, I depended
on official
on
taking
guides.
you through a place that others don't.
I could read just enough Polish just not to get lost.
Yeah.
But I did depend on younger Poles to take me around, because I would spend weeks in Poland, you know, driving from site to site, and taking pictures of the memorials and and I wanted to know what the Polish guides
Sure.
were saying. For example, you know, and I heard all these, you know, great but kind of chilling stories that Polish guides, often doing their PhDs in history and World War II history, leading tours at Auschwitz, but then being mistaken by young American Jewish tourists for their jail keepers.
Oh.
I mean, they're just guiding them through, and it was often the young Polish guides' grandparents were in Auschwitz. That's why they have an interest. But then they're being yelled at and kind of mistreated by younger Israelis and things who see the Poles as somehow the enemies and the keepers of Auschwitz. And they go, no. They weren't located in Poland because of Polish anti-Semitism, whether there was, even though there was, but because those were the centers of Jewish life, and so it was just that the Germans could do it and hide it best, in Poland. But needing that kind of conditioning, and a lot of these kids just weren't very well prepared before they came, to Auschwitz. In fact, so it's another point I was saying about levels of translation around. Now there are levels of translation, not just from generation to generation.
It's like from the inner to the outer, from
Well,
generation, and then from crossing language or linguistic barriers.
I was thinking, I guess maybe I'm thinking of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah is also another great example. It's a little bit of an echo chamber of all these levels of translation. Where he asks the question in French, it gets translated to Polish or Yiddish or Hebrew, and then it comes back in that language, and then it gets retranslated to him by his interpreter. And then often you'll see 3 or 4 levels of subtitles all at once. Because you need them all. And the kinds of stories and the things that get left out of the translations are always interesting, always interesting. Because he was trying to provoke half of his questions were so provocative, especially in Poland. He was pretty nasty in Poland. The Poles hate that movie, by the way, because of his portrayal of peasants and all that. And a lot of what they said didn't even get translated to him because the interpreter knew that if she really translated everything, he'd have a field day. So she was very careful to protect them a little bit.
In translation, we discuss often the problem of untranslatability and the problem of finding a language. And we have been obsessed of fidelity, being faithful to the original, and translation is always a loss. It's always impossible, and we have the problem of untranslatability. But then you have to find other languages. It's always translation is always a kind of research to find a new language. And what you are saying so naturally again is that this new expression can be not only in another natural language, but it can be with how you look,
the physicality, the breath,
yes,
the breathing,
yes, the silences. So you have so many expressions, and also I wanted to connect now to the memorials, to sculptures, to visible things. And since we are in New York, it would be natural to speak about the memorial of 9/11. How do you present? How do you translate an event, the trauma of that event, the impossibility of speaking about it, the problem of giving it a word, to find a language, the necessity also of finding a language that is not only told but visible. You have a space, you have to fill that space with something. Not only words, you have the names, but how do you translate all that trauma, all that event into something visible? The memory of that.
Like most people, I thought that there was a rush to memory and a rush to translate it, almost as a, translate it into memory before it was memory yet.
Mm.
Literally within 2 weeks of the attacks, I was getting calls from the mayor's office and the governor's office.
Is that Bloomberg at the time?
No, it's
Before?
Giuliani's office at
Giuliani.
the time, and they were making academic conferences around memory of 9/11, and I just said it's not memory.
Mm.
Yeah, right.
Mm.
It's unfolding.
Mm.
To remember, we need to already know kind of what it
Distance.
meant, and we don't know what it meant. We don't know if it's the first of many attacks. We don't know what the aftermath, or if we're right in the middle of more. The only people who have maybe a grasp of what it means are those who directly lost loved ones. For them, it's about loss,
Mm.
about the loss of moms, dads, brothers, sisters, and spouses. And so that's the meaning of this event at this moment. And maybe for the city and for people who didn't know anybody, it's the loss of two unlovely skyscrapers that the city had grown to love. And especially now that they're gone, they love them very much.
Mm.
They love them in their loss. And I go, that's normal. That's okay.
Mhm.
So I said, rather than worrying about what the final memory is going to be, give yourselves time and space to internalize the loss. And here I use the example of Jewish mourning tradition. And so that after a loved one passes, you spend a week sitting Shiva. It's an uncomfortable time. It's kind of an inward time. People come and they mourn with you and they support you and they console you. But in this time, for the first month, actually, then the period of Shloshim, for 30 days, if you're traditional, there's no shaving, there are no weddings, no parties. And this is a time when literally you allow your kind of your outer visage to reflect kind of your inner
Supposed to cover the
torment.
mirrors and
You cover the mirrors in order not to be thinking about yourself or reflecting yourself, but in order to be thinking only about the lost loved one.
Mm.
So there's a way over time to internalize that loss and come to live with it.
Mm.
And 1 year later, you unveil a matzeva or a tombstone. And so literally, you've taken a year to internalize and come to live with that loss before then finding an external expression in the landscape, the stone, which you put out, and then you visit once a year, prescribed to visit it once a year, and you put a little stone to mark your visit. And it's a way to both integrate loss and live with it and go on. Life
Correct.
goes on, and it's a way to systematically organize that loss. And so I would just recommend that you all take a deep breath and relax. And give yourselves time to figure out what this loss is, who's lost what it means for the city, what it means, how is it going to be instrumentalized, unfortunately, what the government's going to do with this.
Yeah.
And the government knew exactly what they were going to do
Trying
with
to
it
shape
on
the
that
memory.
day. They took that loss and they converted it, to policy and action and, and punishment. Go out and get Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, thing related and not. They're going to go do it no matter what. And that's that's what happens when you fix the memory. It means only one thing, and now that means you have to act on it. And so everybody did take some time. And then by the time the first year rolled around, of course, Bloomberg was now mayor. And it was kind of interesting. By then, they had brought me back to speak to families. To put this in perspective as well, they thought that whatever my message was, maybe it was something that the mayor's office understood, but they said, maybe I think the family members would appreciate hearing. And so I came back and talked to neighborhood councils and family member groups. And in that first year, what was it? It was August 2002. So it wasn't even a year yet. Anita Contini was appointed to head the memorial process by the LMDC. And she, I read in the Times that morning, oh, look at Anita Contini is appointed by the mayor to head the memorial process. She will now be a vice president for memorial process in the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. Interesting, good. And I knew who she was because she had been the director of Creative Time, an arts agency downtown, which was responsible for commissioning the celebratory tribute in light, which was originally conceived and commissioned to celebrate the anniversary of the World Trade Center towers. And they were going to beam them from the tops of the towers, those beautiful blue lights. But now, eventually they were used to memorialize the towers themselves. So I'm literally reading that, and then the phone rings. I mean, like a few hours later. And it's Anita Contini. She says, hello, James? Yes. He goes, this is Anita Contini. I go, hi, Anita. I'm just reading about you. She goes, you were probably expecting my call. And I go, no, not really. She goes, well, I've begun researching, and everybody I talk to says we have to come back to you. And would you meet me in our weekend home in the Berkshires, at a place in East Egremont? I go, sure, an hour's drive. So we'll be coming in, tomorrow, and would you come for lunch? So sure. So I drive out there, and beautiful summer home, and the sunroom. Remember, this is summertime. It's in August, I think. Is piled high with books on memorials and memory. Everything from Freud. It would look like my library. So she's just gone out on Amazon or whatever and just had ordered hundreds of books, and she's just reading everything. She says, where to begin? What do I talk to? How do we do this? I mean, what do we do? And so you're doing it. You're, wow, look at this library you have. And again, just create that space, do the research you want to do. There are people out there thinking about these things. I'm one, but there are many people, smarter than I am, who could talk about these things. And Paul Goldberger was very good, and Maya Lin, has thought about these things. And so we were all kind of brought in between August and January, February, speaking to family groups. And then in March, we got a call. I got a call from John Whitehead first, and then from Pataki's office, asking if I would serve on a jury, for the process. It's not too early, is it? I said, no, we know it's going to take time. And so Anita really had put together this process in a very systematic, very professional way. And I was invited, and Maya Lin was invited, and Vartan Grigorian. So it's kind of a bit of a finding an unimpeachable jury, something that would give the mayor political coverage, would give the LMDC political coverage, the historian, Susan Friedman from the Public Art Fund, Paula Grant Berry, the wife of somebody who was killed, with 3 young kids, at home. And so this was, a jury, 12-person jury. With David Rockefeller as the symbolic 13th, but not participating.
And in the jury, did you make decisions on what you were searching, what you wanted?
We didn't prescribe what it was going to be. The chemistry was great. Michael Van Valkenburg, the landscape architect who had designed a lot of Battery Park City's gardens and who did the whole Brooklyn Promenade, was on the jury. Maya Lin, Martin Purrier, a wonderful artist, sculptor, Enrique Norton, a Mexican-born architect who is based in New York now and who teaches at University of Pennsylvania, was there. So this blend of architects, artists, cultural historians, academics, arts professionals, Lowry Sims from the Harlem Studio Museum, people with just contemporary sensibilities and eyes, and patience, knowing that nobody went in there saying it's going to be this, it's going to be a new trade center, it's going to be. We said, in fact, we made very clear when we were presented to the public that we not only do we not know what it's going to be, but if we don't find anything, we're going to live with that too, and we're going to say.
This whole process, I think that's one of your strengths, is you're listening and you're getting people to talk, and you're not making I think not making certain decisions can be part of the memorial process, if that makes any sense. So sometimes not putting the word down on a page allows you to think about a range of possibilities, and often the more you think before you write, the bigger the range of possibilities, the more artists you have submitting ideas, maybe the better the final product is.
I would agree, and I think that somebody being systematic now might just follow that, as a system. I think I came at it probably more intuitively. I didn't come in saying I'm going to keep this space open and not let anybody decide, because in fact our job was to choose one. And I just wanted to leave that space open as long as possible, knowing that the one thing you end up choosing comes to displace all that work, all those other designs.
But that designing process and those ideas I think it can be therapeutic for a town, for government officials, for artists themselves, for the people who lost.
Well, the mayor and the governor's offices, they were a little anxious. They were a little worried. What if we don't come up with something? What if it's not good? Are we flaky? Are we gonna find something that's unbuildable? Something so conceptual. So there was, and they had to make a leap of faith, and we had to make a leap of faith and not concentrate on the result. And that's really hard to tell. The mayor just did not want to hear that. Don't worry about what it's going to be. But that's the whole job, is to get, no. Leave it open. If you're so worried about what it's going to be, you're going to foreclose the whole process. That whatever it takes, whatever time it needs, we have to
But
allow
finally, it
for.
was not so long, this process.
No, well, they set deadlines. They said, so they announced the competition. I think it was April 22nd, 2003. The deadline to register was, I think, June 1st. And the deadline for the actual submission was, I think, August 1st.
Wow, that's
So it's kind of, huge architectural firms, and the submissions came in a standardized format. It was axiometric boards with both drawings from several dimensions and a computerized image of what it would look like, whatever it's going to be, with a small conceptual text explaining what it is they were doing and why. And then we spent, 12 hours a day for a month or 6 weeks just looking at all these, and holed up in hotels downtown, unable to talk to the press, anybody about it.